She's our dead end, Thomas Brooks said with a chuckle at his daughter's $250,000 wedding, and the guests around him laughed as if it were just another harmless family joke. The words floated above the white linen tables and crystal glasses, light and careless, but Eleanor Brooks felt them land with the weight of something far heavier. The ceremony had taken place on a sunlit hillside in Napa Valley, rows of ivory chairs facing a floral arch imported from Italy, every rose and peony arranged to perfection. A string quartet played softly near the vineyard, and servers moved gracefully with trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than Eleanor used to spend on groceries in a week. Charlotte Brooks, radiant in a designer gown that had been custom-fitted in New York, stood at the center of it all, glowing under the late afternoon light, the kind of bride people described as effortless. Eleanor stood off to the side in a simple navy dress she had bought on sale, her heels sinking slightly into the manicured grass as she adjusted her clutch and forced her lips into a polite smile. She had flown in from Seattle 2 days earlier, paid for her own ticket, booked a modest hotel 20 minutes away because every room at the luxury resort had been reserved for real guests, as her mother had phrased it. Throughout the reception, she listened as relatives and business associates praised Charlotte's engagement ring, admired Daniel Whitmore's family connections, and marveled at the rumored cost of the open bar alone. Whenever someone asked about Eleanor, the tone shifted, just slightly, like a background note going off-key. "So what are you up to these days?" a woman in a gold cocktail dress asked, her eyes scanning Eleanor's outfit before settling on her face. Before Eleanor could answer, Thomas leaned in with a casual wave of his hand. "Oh, you know Eleanor. She's tried a few things. Nothing really stuck." The small circle of guests smiled in polite confusion, then laughed softly, unsure whether they were supposed to. Linda Brooks added, almost kindly, "She's still figuring herself out." Eleanor nodded as if they were discussing the weather, her expression calm, her posture straight. She had grown used to this choreography years ago, the way her achievements were minimized, her risks reframed as recklessness, her silence mistaken for lack of ambition. As the sun dipped lower and the vineyard lights flickered on, casting a golden glow over the reception tent, Eleanor stepped away from the crowd and stood near the edge of the property, looking out over the rolling hills. The music swelled behind her, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell like waves, and somewhere in the distance her father's voice carried again, telling another guest that Charlotte had always been the driven one, the success story. Eleanor did not correct him. She did not argue. She simply watched the horizon darken, knowing something her parents did not, something that would change the way they told this story when the night was over. The reception continued as if nothing unusual had been said, as if words did not linger in the air long after laughter faded. Eleanor remained near the edge of the vineyard until the evening breeze turned cooler, then she walked back toward the tent with steady steps, her expression composed, her shoulders relaxed. Inside, the long farmhouse tables were glowing under strings of warm lights, each place setting arranged with precision, gold flatware aligned perfectly beside custom-printed menus that listed organic salmon, truffle risotto, and a dessert trio flown in from San Francisco that morning. Charlotte moved from table to table like someone born for attention, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, her smile bright and practiced. Thomas stood near the bar telling a group of men about the wedding budget, emphasizing the numbers with pride, repeating the figure as if it were proof of something larger than celebration. Linda nodded beside him, adding small details about the months of planning, the guest list approvals, the private tastings. When Eleanor approached to refill her glass with sparkling water, her mother glanced at her and offered a tight smile. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked, the question polite but distant. Eleanor nodded once. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice even. She did not add that beauty had always been expensive in her family, that approval often came with a price tag attached. A former classmate of Charlotte's turned toward Eleanor and asked where she was living now. "Seattle," Eleanor replied. The woman raised her eyebrows slightly. "Oh, that is different." Thomas gave a short laugh. "She likes the rainy weather. Plenty of time to think about what comes next." The group smiled again, and Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of standing just outside the frame of a photograph, present but not centered. She excused herself and walked toward the back of the tent where a large framed timeline displayed Charlotte and Daniel's relationship milestones. First vacation, first apartment, engagement in Paris. Guests paused to admire the glossy prints. Eleanor studied the board for a moment, noticing how every achievement was curated, every step documented and celebrated. Her own milestones had unfolded quietly over the past decade, without champagne toasts or engraved invitations. She remembered the night she packed 2 suitcases into her old sedan at 22 years old, the engine light glowing faintly on the dashboard as she drove east out of town with $200 in her checking account and no guarantee of where she would land. No one had thrown her a farewell dinner. No one had asked about her plan. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and the newlyweds stepped onto the dance floor under a spotlight. Applause filled the tent. Eleanor watched from the side, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She noticed a few guests glancing at her, curious but uncertain, as if trying to place her role in the story. She met their eyes calmly, offering a small, unreadable smile. The night was still young, the speeches yet to begin, and Eleanor understood that in her family, timing was everything. She waited, patient and silent, knowing that the narrative her parents had repeated for years was about to face something they had never anticipated. The speeches began just after sunset, when the sky had turned a deep shade of blue and the vineyard lights glowed like scattered stars across the hillside. Guests settled into their chairs, forks resting beside half-finished plates, conversations lowering into an attentive hum. Thomas was the first to stand, adjusting his tailored jacket as he walked toward the microphone with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being heard. He began with stories about Charlotte's childhood, about spelling bees and piano recitals, and the first time she declared she would only attend a top-tier university. Laughter rose at the right moments, applause followed the sentimental lines, and Daniel's family nodded approvingly. Then Thomas shifted, his tone light, but edged with something sharper. He spoke about how proud he was that Charlotte had always known her direction, how she had never wavered, never settled, never taken the easy road. Some people, he added with a small smile, need a little more time to figure out where they are headed. A few guests glanced toward Eleanor instinctively. Linda leaned toward the microphone next, reinforcing the narrative with polished warmth. She described Charlotte as the embodiment of focus and perseverance, then added that every family had its contrasts, that sometimes one child shined early while another preferred to wander. The word lingered in the air. Wander. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm, her gaze steady on the dance floor rather than the stage. She had heard versions of this comparison her entire life, subtle distinctions drawn at holidays and report card nights, at graduations and birthdays, always wrapped in humor or gentle concern. When the applause faded and Daniel offered a gracious thank you, the music resumed softly in the background. Guests began to stand, some heading toward the bar, others toward the photo booth set up beneath a canopy of lights. Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the rhythm of the evening. She felt no rush to defend herself, no impulse to interrupt the carefully crafted storyline. Instead, she observed how easily people accepted what they were told, how quickly a label could become a legacy if repeated often enough. Across the tent, a man in a charcoal suit had been listening quietly during the speeches. He had arrived late, slipping into a seat near the back without drawing attention, his presence unnoticed by most. Now he scanned the crowd as if searching for someone specific. Eleanor rose from her chair and stepped aside to allow a group of guests to pass, her movement unhurried. As she turned toward the exit of the tent for a breath of fresh air, the man's eyes landed on her. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something close to respect. He began walking in her direction with measured steps, weaving through the clusters of guests who were still laughing about the toast. Eleanor did not see him yet. She stood at the edge of the reception space once more, looking out at the darkening hills, the music soft behind her, unaware that the quiet certainty she carried was about to intersect with someone who knew exactly where she had ended up. The night air carried the faint scent of crushed grapes and expensive perfume as Eleanor stood at the edge of the vineyard, the music behind her blending into a distant hum. She sensed movement before she heard his voice. "I was hoping I would see you here," the man in the charcoal suit said, stopping a respectful distance away. Eleanor turned, her expression composed, and studied him for a brief moment before recognition settled in. His name was Marcus Hale, managing partner of Northbridge Capital, a firm that had once taken a calculated risk on a small logistics platform built by a founder few investors initially took seriously. "I did not know you were connected to the Whitmores," Eleanor said calmly. Marcus gave a slight smile. "Daniel's uncle sits on one of our advisory boards. I came to support the family. I did not expect to hear your name in a toast." His eyes flicked toward the tent, where laughter rose again. Although not in the way it should have been mentioned. Eleanor did not respond to that. She looked back toward the hills, her posture relaxed, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as anticipated. Marcus continued in a lower voice. "The acquisition closed last quarter. $40 million is not what I would call wandering." The number hung quietly between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, simply factual. Eleanor nodded once. "It was a fair valuation," she said. She remembered the first warehouse she had rented in Seattle, 1,200 square feet, with uneven concrete floors and a single flickering fluorescent light. She remembered driving a used cargo van herself, loading shipments by hand, calculating fuel costs down to the mile, because every dollar mattered. There had been nights when she reviewed spreadsheets at a folding table in her apartment, rain tapping steadily against the window, her phone silent except for automated bank notifications. No one from home had called to ask how it was going. No one had offered advice. When the second round of funding fell through years earlier, she had adjusted, restructured, negotiated vendor contracts personally, and rebuilt the model line by line. It had not been glamorous. It had been precise. Marcus glanced toward the reception tent where Thomas was gesturing animatedly to a circle of guests, unaware that the narrative he had delivered minutes ago was already outdated. "Are you planning to tell them?" Marcus asked. Eleanor considered the question. Without urgency. Inside the tent, Charlotte and Daniel were cutting a 5-tier cake under soft golden lights, cameras flashing, applause rising once more. "I am not planning anything," Eleanor replied evenly. "I came to celebrate my sister." Marcus studied her for a moment, perhaps recognizing that her restraint was not weakness but control. A breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it behind her ear with a small, unhurried motion. From inside, someone called her name, a cousin perhaps, inviting her back for a group photograph. Eleanor took one final look at the dark horizon, then turned toward the glow of the reception. As she stepped forward, Marcus walked beside her, not leading, not following, simply present. Neither of them raised their voices. They did not need to. Sometimes the most significant shifts in a story happened without announcement, unfolding quietly in the space between what was assumed and what was true. When Eleanor stepped back into the reception tent beside Marcus, the shift was almost imperceptible at first, like a subtle change in temperature before a storm. The photographer was arranging family members near the dance floor, calling out names with cheerful authority, guiding Charlotte and Daniel into the center, while parents and relatives formed a semicircle around them. Linda spotted Eleanor and gestured for her to stand at the far edge, near the end of the row, slightly outside the frame of the spotlight. Eleanor moved without complaint, smoothing the fabric of her navy dress as she took her place. Marcus remained a few steps behind, speaking briefly with one of Daniel's uncles, but his presence did not go unnoticed. A tall man in an understated charcoal suit carried a different kind of weight than floral arrangements or champagne towers. Thomas, who had been laughing moments earlier, paused mid-sentence when he saw Marcus approach. Recognition dawned slowly. He had seen that face before in business journals and financial interviews, usually beside headlines about strategic acquisitions and high-growth exits. Marcus extended his hand with calm professionalism. "Thomas Brooks," he said evenly. "I do not believe we have met. I work closely with your daughter." Thomas smiled automatically, glancing at Charlotte before returning his attention to Marcus. "Charlotte has a wonderful marketing team," he replied, assuming the connection. Marcus did not correct him immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Eleanor, who stood quietly beneath. The string lights, her expression composed. "Actually," Marcus continued, "I was referring to Eleanor." The surrounding conversation thinned. Linda's smile faltered just enough to register. "Eleanor," she repeated, as if testing the name in an unfamiliar context. Marcus nodded. "Her company has been one of our most strategic investments in the past 5 years." We finalized a $40 million acquisition earlier this year. The logistics platform she built has changed how small retailers manage national shipping. It has been remarkable to watch. The words were delivered without exaggeration, without fanfare, simply as a statement of fact. A silence spread outward from the small circle, subtle but undeniable. Thomas's posture shifted, his shoulders straightening as if recalibrating his understanding of the moment. "I was not aware," he said carefully. Eleanor met his gaze for the first time that evening, her eyes steady, not triumphant, not wounded, simply present. "You did not ask," she replied, her tone even and unhurried. Around them, guests exchanged glances, the earlier jokes dissolving into something closer to curiosity. Charlotte, still holding Daniel's hand, studied her sister with a new expression, one that held surprise, but also something else, perhaps respect she had not previously considered. The photographer, unsure whether to continue, lowered his camera slightly. The vineyard lights glowed warmly overhead, the music continuing as if the night had not shifted on its axis. Eleanor did not step forward to claim the center of the frame. She did not recount the years of calculated risk or the miles driven across Washington state negotiating warehouse contracts. She allowed the facts to exist on their own. In that quiet space between assumption and reality, the story her parents had repeated for decades began to unravel without a single raised voice. For a long moment no one moved, as if the reception tent itself had paused to reconsider what it had just witnessed. The string lights continued to glow softly above polished tables, the band resumed a gentle instrumental piece, and servers carried trays of champagne through a crowd that now spoke in lower, more measured tones. Thomas cleared his throat, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket as though the conversation had only taken a minor detour. "Well," he began carefully, "that is certainly impressive." The confidence in his voice sounded newly constructed, assembled from pieces of surprise and calculation. Linda stepped closer to Eleanor, her expression no longer dismissive but searching. "You never mentioned any of this," she said, her words controlled but edged with something unsettled. Eleanor met her mother's eyes without hostility. "There were many times," she replied calmly, "when I considered it. It just never seemed necessary." Around them, a few guests leaned subtly closer, pretending to examine the floral arrangements while clearly listening. Charlotte released Daniel's hand and walked toward her sister, the layers of her gown brushing lightly across the wooden dance floor. $40 million, she asked quietly, not with envy, but with genuine disbelief. Eleanor nodded once. "It was not about the number," she said. "It was about building something that worked." She did not elaborate. She did not describe the months spent negotiating contracts across 3 states, the careful expansion from 1 warehouse to 5, or the years spent refining software that allowed independent retailers to compete with national chains. The details remained hers. Marcus, still standing nearby, spoke again with measured ease. Her model increased efficiency by 23% for mid-sized distributors in the Pacific Northwest. That is not wandering. That is strategy. The statement was clinical, almost understated, yet it carried more weight than any joke told earlier that evening. Thomas glanced around at the circle of attentive faces and seemed to recognize that the narrative he had shaped for years no longer fit the facts before him. "We always knew she was capable," he said quickly, as if revising history in real time. Eleanor did not contradict him. She simply held his gaze for a brief second, then looked away toward the vineyard beyond the tent. The hills were dark now, outlined only by moonlight, steady and unmoved by applause or opinion. A waiter passed between them offering glasses of sparkling wine, and Linda accepted one absent-mindedly, her attention still fixed on her younger daughter. "Why Seattle?" she asked softly. Eleanor considered the question. "Because no one there knew who I was supposed to be," she answered. The simplicity of it seemed to land more firmly than the earlier revelation. Music swelled again, signaling the beginning of another dance, and the photographer cleared his throat, gently guiding the family back into position. This time, when he arranged the lineup, he placed Eleanor closer to the center without comment. She did not resist. She did not step forward either. She simply stood where she was asked, composed and quiet, as the camera flashed and captured a version of the family that, for the first time in years, felt closer to the truth than the story told at the microphone. The rest of the evening unfolded with a different rhythm, one that felt quieter but more deliberate, as if every glance carried a recalibration. Guests who had earlier smiled politely now approached Eleanor with measured curiosity, their questions no longer casual but considered. A woman from Daniel's extended family asked about market expansion on the West Coast, and this time Thomas did not interrupt. He stood slightly behind his daughter, listening, his expression caught somewhere between pride and realization. Eleanor answered simply, explaining how independent retailers struggled with national shipping contracts, and how her platform negotiated better rates through aggregated volume. She spoke without performance, without embellishment, her tone steady and precise. The numbers she mentioned were clear, grounded in facts, not ego. Charlotte watched from a few feet away, holding a glass of champagne she had barely touched. For the first time that day, the spotlight did not belong exclusively to the bride. It was not dramatic. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. Linda stepped closer again, studying Eleanor as though seeing her at a different angle. It must have been difficult, she said softly, starting over like that. Eleanor considered the question. It was quiet, she replied. Quiet can be useful. The band transitioned into a livelier song, encouraging guests back onto the dance floor. Laughter returned, but it sounded different now, less certain in its hierarchy. Thomas cleared his throat and addressed Marcus with renewed respect, asking about investment strategies, about market trends, about future projections. Marcus answered with professional courtesy but redirected several questions back to Eleanor, reinforcing without spectacle that she was the architect of her own outcome. When the newlyweds took the floor again, Charlotte caught her sister's eye and gave a small nod, not apologetic, not dramatic, but acknowledging something unspoken. Eleanor returned the gesture, understanding that recognition did not require confrontation. As the evening drew closer to its end, guests began collecting jackets and favors, commenting on the beauty of the venue and the flawless coordination. The vineyard lights shimmered against the dark sky, steady and unchanged. Thomas approached Eleanor one final time before the final round of toasts. His voice was lower, now stripped of earlier humor. You should have told us, he said, not accusing, not defensive, simply uncertain. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. You already had a version of me, she answered. There did not seem to be room for another. The statement was not sharp. It was factual. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. Across the tent, servers began clearing dessert plates, and the music softened into a closing melody. Eleanor glanced toward the hills once more, feeling neither vindicated nor resentful. She had not come to rewrite the past. She had come to stand in the present. And as the final photographs were taken beneath the golden lights, the family portrait captured something new, not perfection, not competition, but a balance that had been absent for years, quietly restored without a single raised voice. By the time the last song faded into the night and guests began drifting toward the waiting shuttles, the air inside the reception tent felt lighter, as if something unspoken had been set down at last. Eleanor stood near the exit, thanking relatives who now addressed her with a tone that held new awareness. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic confessions, only subtle recalibrations in posture and language. Thomas shook hands with several business associates, and more than once he gestured toward Eleanor not as an afterthought, but as a point of reference. My daughter built a logistics firm in Seattle, he said, the sentence careful, deliberate, reshaped. Linda remained close to Charlotte, adjusting the train of her gown, but her eyes kept returning to Eleanor with quiet reflection. When most of the guests had departed and only immediate family remained beneath the dimmed string lights, Charlotte approached her sister without the crowd as an audience. I did not know, she said simply. There was no rivalry in her voice, only honesty. Eleanor offered a small, understanding smile. You were busy building your life, she replied. So was I. The vineyard stretched out in silence beyond them, rows of vines resting under moonlight, steady and unchanged by celebration. Daniel joined them briefly, offering congratulations with genuine respect before being called away by his parents. For the first time that evening, the conversation between the sisters felt balanced, not defined by comparison but by parallel paths that had simply unfolded differently. Thomas stepped closer after a moment, hands in his pockets, his voice no longer amplified by a microphone or buoyed by laughter. "We may have underestimated you," he admitted, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Eleanor considered the statement. She did not rush to reassure him or to correct the phrasing. "You underestimated what you did not see," she answered gently. The distinction settled between them. There were years that could not be rewritten, assumptions that had shaped family gatherings and quiet judgments. But there was also the present, steady and undeniable. A staff member began extinguishing candles one by one, small flames disappearing into thin threads of smoke. The photographer packed away equipment, and the vineyard staff folded chairs in efficient rows. The spectacle had ended. What remained was quieter and more real. Eleanor glanced once more at the hillside where the ceremony had taken place hours earlier, remembering how small she had felt standing at the edge of the crowd. The landscape had not changed, but her place within it had. As she prepared to leave for her hotel, Marcus offered a brief nod of acknowledgement before heading toward his own car. Charlotte hugged her sister lightly, careful of her dress, and Linda touched Eleanor's arm with unfamiliar gentleness. There was no triumphant speech, no final declaration. Only a shift in understanding that would echo long after the vineyard returned to stillness. And as Eleanor walked toward the gravel path leading to the parking area, the sound of her heels steady against the ground, she carried not vindication but clarity, knowing that sometimes the most powerful arrival is the one that requires no announcement at all. The gravel crunched softly beneath Eleanor's heels as she made her way toward the parking area, the vineyard now quiet except for distant voices and the low hum of generators powering the last strands of light. The night air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of earth and fading perfume, and for the first time all evening she allowed herself a slow breath that did not feel measured. Behind her, the celebration was being dismantled piece by piece, tables cleared, candles extinguished, music reduced to memory. She reached her rental car and paused before unlocking it, glancing back at the hillside where Charlotte had set her vows. From this distance, the venue looked smaller, less theatrical, like any other stretch of California countryside under the moon. Her phone vibrated in her clutch. A message from Thomas appeared on the screen. "Can we have breakfast tomorrow before you fly back?" The wording was careful, stripped of humor, stripped of assumption. Eleanor read it twice before replying. "Yes, 8:30. The hotel cafe." She did not add anything else. She slid into the driver's seat and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the quiet. 10 years earlier, she had driven away from her parents' house in a used sedan with a cracked dashboard and a full tank paid for with her last paycheck. That departure had felt uncertain, edged with defiance and necessity. Tonight's drive felt different. It was not escape. It was choice. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the muted calm that follows a large event. The hotel cafe overlooked rolling hills still tinted with early light. Eleanor arrived on time, dressed simply in a cream blouse and tailored slacks, her posture relaxed. Thomas was already seated at a small round table near the window, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. He stood when she approached, an unfamiliar formality in the gesture. "Thank you for coming," he said. Eleanor took her seat without hurry. "You asked," she replied. There was no tension in her voice, only steadiness. Thomas studied her face as if trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman sitting across from him. "I may have relied too heavily on comparison," he admitted after a moment. Charlotte's path was visible. Yours was not. Eleanor folded her hands lightly on the table. "Not all growth happens in front of an audience," she said. Outside the window, a delivery truck rolled slowly down the road, practical and unremarkable. Thomas nodded, absorbing the statement. There were no dramatic apologies, no sudden transformation, only recognition taking root in real time. When the waitress brought their coffee, Eleanor thanked her quietly and looked back at her father with calm clarity. The story he had told for years no longer fit the evidence before him. And as the morning sun climbed higher over Napa Valley, illuminating the vineyard that had hosted both celebration and revelation, Eleanor understood that the most important change was not the shift in how others saw her, but the certainty with which she had learned to see herself. Thomas stirred his coffee slowly, watching the dark liquid circle the inside of the cup as if searching for the right words in its reflection. The morning crowd in the cafe was quiet. A few early travelers checking their phones, a couple seated near the window discussing winery tours, waitstaff moving with calm efficiency between tables. The spectacle of the previous night felt distant, almost theatrical in hindsight, as though it had belonged to a different family. I thought success had to look a certain way, Thomas said at last, his voice lower than usual, stripped of presentation. Degrees from the right schools. Titles people recognize. Promotions you can explain in one sentence. Eleanor listened without interruption, her posture relaxed but attentive. That is one version, she replied evenly. It is not the only one. She did not mention the early years again, the rented warehouse with uneven flooring, the spreadsheets balanced late into the night, the months when profit margins were so thin she measured expenses down to gallons of fuel and square footage of storage. Those memories were not trophies. They were foundations. Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing what had likely been obvious to others but unfamiliar to him. When you left, he continued, I assumed you would circle back once you realized how difficult it would be. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. It was difficult, she said. I just did not circle back. The simplicity of the statement settled over the table like a quiet truth that required no embellishment. Outside the window, sunlight stretched across the vineyard hills, illuminating rows of vines that had stood through countless seasons of pruning and growth. The waitress refilled their cups, and Thomas thanked her with a distracted nod before turning back to his daughter. I am proud of you, he said finally. The words were not dramatic, not accompanied by a grand gesture. They were measured, perhaps overdue, but sincere. Eleanor accepted them without visible reaction, as though she understood that pride, like recognition, often arrives later than effort. Thank you, she answered softly. They sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, simply adjusting to a new understanding. Thomas glanced at his watch. Will you stay another day? He asked. Your mother would like to spend more time. Eleanor considered the offer. Her return flight to Seattle was scheduled for late afternoon. Meetings awaited her next week, contracts in progress, a board review she would chair. I will have lunch, she said. After a pause. Then I need to get back. Thomas nodded, respecting the boundary. The conversation drifted to practical topics after that. Travel schedules, Charlotte's honeymoon plans, the logistics of merging families across different states. The irony did not escape Eleanor that the word logistics now carried more weight in her life than it ever had in casual conversation. When they stood to leave, Thomas placed a few bills on the table and hesitated briefly before giving his daughter a firm, steady embrace. It was not theatrical. It was not apologetic. It was grounding. As Eleanor walked out into the bright Napa morning, the vineyard no longer felt like a stage. It felt like scenery behind a chapter that had quietly closed. She drove toward the airport with the windows slightly lowered, warm air moving through the car, her thoughts steady and clear. The shift that had begun beneath string lights the night before did not require further proof. It had already taken root. And as the highway stretched ahead in long, uninterrupted lines, Eleanor understood that she was not driving away from anything unfinished. She was simply continuing forward, exactly as she always had. The airport terminal in Oakland was bright with late morning light, travelers moving in steady lines towards security checkpoints and departure gates, rolling suitcases humming softly across polished floors. Eleanor stood near the window overlooking the runway, boarding pass in hand, watching a plane lift into the clear blue sky. The weekend had felt compressed, as if 10 years of misunderstanding had been folded into a single evening and a quiet breakfast conversation. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Charlotte. I have been thinking about what you said, about building something that works. I would like to visit Seattle sometime. Eleanor read the message carefully before replying. You are welcome anytime. There were no additional words, no explanation attached. She slipped her phone back into her bag and moved toward her gate, her steps unhurried. The flight back to Seattle was just under 2 hours, a manageable distance that once had felt symbolic, like the space between expectation and independence. As she settled into her seat by the window, she glanced at a notebook tucked inside her carry-on, filled with handwritten notes from early strategy meetings, ideas scribbled in ink that had slightly faded over time. She had kept it not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of precision, of how clarity could emerge from quiet persistence. When the plane lifted from the runway and Napa Valley receded into a patchwork of vineyards and roads below, Eleanor did not feel a need to replay the wedding in her mind. The scene had already shifted into memory, its impact absorbed without spectacle. In Seattle, gray clouds drifted lazily above the skyline when she arrived, the air cooler, familiar, steady. A rideshare driver helped with her luggage, asking casually if she had been traveling for business. Family, she replied with a small smile. Back at her apartment overlooking Puget Sound, she set her bag down near the door and stood for a moment in the quiet living room. The space was modern but understated, wide windows framing water and distant ferries moving across the horizon. There were no trophies on the shelves, no framed headlines announcing acquisitions, only a few carefully chosen photographs and a single abstract painting that reminded her of shifting landscapes. Her phone rang once more. This time it was Linda. Eleanor answered. "We would like to understand more about what you built," her mother said gently. "Not the number. The work." Eleanor leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out at the water. "I can explain," she replied. The conversation that followed was practical, curious, stripped of comparison. When it ended, Eleanor placed the phone down and walked to her desk, opening her laptop to review the week ahead. Contracts, strategy sessions, expansion plans into the Midwest. The vineyard lights and champagne flutes were far behind her now, replaced by the quiet hum of a city she had chosen for herself. Outside, a ferry horn echoed softly across the water. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief second, not in relief, not in triumph, but in recognition. The destination had never been Napa Valley. It had always been here, in the steady continuation of work she believed in. And as she began drafting notes for her next board meeting, the narrative that once defined her without consent had finally dissolved, replaced by one she had built line by line, mile by mile, without announcement. The week unfolded with the steady rhythm Eleanor had always trusted, meetings layered one after another, conference calls that began precisely on time, and strategy sessions that focused not on applause but on execution. In the glass-walled boardroom overlooking Elliott Bay, she stood at the head of the table as charts illuminated the large screen behind her, outlining projected expansion into 3 additional distribution hubs across the Midwest. Her team listened carefully, asking precise questions about capacity, freight rates, and long-term scalability. There were no jokes about wandering here, no comparisons to siblings or expectations inherited from childhood. There were only metrics, responsibility, and forward movement. After the meeting, as the team filtered out with tablets and coffee cups in hand, Marcus paused beside her. "You handled that weekend with restraint," he observed. Eleanor closed her laptop gently. "It was never about proving anything," she replied. "It was about allowing the facts to speak when they were ready." Marcus nodded, recognizing the discipline in that approach. Later that evening, as rain tapped lightly against her apartment windows, Eleanor opened her email to find a message from Thomas. It was brief, direct, and uncharacteristically reflective. He wrote that he had been reviewing his own assumptions, that he had relied too heavily on visible milestones, that he wanted to do better. There were no dramatic apologies, only acknowledgement. Eleanor read the message slowly, then responded with equal clarity, explaining how her first warehouse lease had required personal guarantees, how she had negotiated shipping contracts that reduced costs by 12% in her first year, how the acquisition had been structured to protect her team's jobs rather than maximize immediate payout. She did not frame it as a lesson. She simply described the work. Over the following days, the tone of her conversations with her family shifted in subtle ways. Charlotte called once from her honeymoon in Italy, describing coastal views and small seaside cafes, then asking thoughtful questions about entrepreneurship, about risk, about what it felt like to build something from nothing. Linda requested articles about supply chain innovation. Thomas mentioned introducing her properly at an upcoming business dinner, not as an afterthought, but as an example. None of it felt theatrical. It felt gradual, grounded. One evening, as Eleanor stood by her window watching a ferry cross the dark water, she reflected not on the wedding itself, but on the years before it, on how silence had once been misinterpreted as absence. She understood now that clarity did not require confrontation. It required consistency. The narrative that once framed her had dissolved. Not because she argued against it, but because she outgrew it. Outside, the city lights shimmered across the sound, steady and unremarkable in their persistence. Eleanor returned to her desk and opened a new document outlining the next phase of expansion, her focus sharp, her movements calm. The vineyard, the microphone, the laughter, all of it had been a moment. This was the continuum. And as she typed the first line of a new proposal, she recognized that arrival is rarely defined by applause. It is defined by the quiet confidence of knowing exactly where you stand and choosing to continue forward without needing permission to do so. Autumn arrived in Seattle with a slow shift in color, the trees along the waterfront turning muted shades of amber and rust, rain falling in steady intervals that felt almost rhythmic against the glass of Eleanor's office. The momentum of expansion had continued without interruption. Contracts finalized for a new distribution hub outside Chicago, negotiations underway for another facility near Dallas. Each milestone was documented in spreadsheets and reviewed in board meetings, not celebrated with champagne, but acknowledged with focused determination. One afternoon, as she finalized a logistics integration timeline, her assistant informed her that she had a visitor in the lobby. Eleanor glanced at the schedule on her tablet, noting that no meeting had been planned. When she stepped into the reception area, she found Thomas standing near the window, his coat folded neatly over his arm, taking in the clean lines of the office space. He looked different outside the context of Napa Valley, less certain, more observant. "I was in town for a conference," he explained, offering a small, almost tentative smile. "I thought I should see this for myself." Eleanor nodded, gesturing toward the glass-walled conference room. "You are welcome to." They walked through the office together, past teams reviewing shipping dashboards and analysts discussing freight cost projections. Thomas asked practical questions, this time listening carefully to the answers. When they reached the operations screen displaying real-time shipment tracking across multiple states, he paused. "You built all of this?" he asked quietly. Eleanor folded her hands loosely in front of her. "With a team," she replied. "But yes, it began with an idea that needed structure." Thomas studied the data moving across the monitors, trucks represented by small digital icons crossing highways thousands of miles away. "I did not understand how much work was invisible," he admitted. Eleanor met his gaze calmly. "Most of it is," she said. They moved to her office overlooking the water, where ferries traced steady paths across Puget Sound. Thomas stood by the window, watching the gray horizon. "I used to measure success by applause," he said slowly. "By what people could see and name." Eleanor considered the statement without judgment. "Applause fades," she replied. "Infrastructure remains." The simplicity of it seemed to settle between them with quiet clarity. Thomas nodded, absorbing the distinction. Before leaving, he turned to her once more. "I am learning," he said, not defensively, not dramatically, simply as fact. Eleanor offered a small, steady smile. "That is enough." When he stepped back into the elevator, she returned to her desk and reopened the integration timeline. Outside, rain continued to fall in soft, persistent lines, steady and unremarkable. The visit had not required confrontation or redemption. It had required presence. And as Eleanor reviewed shipment routes stretching across the country, she understood that understanding, like growth, often happens gradually, revealed not in grand gestures, but in quiet rooms where facts are allowed to stand on their own. Winter settled over Seattle with a quiet persistence, mornings beginning in pale gray light and evenings arriving early beneath low clouds that blurred the skyline. Eleanor's expansion into the Midwest moved from planning to execution, warehouse leases signed, regional managers hired, software integration tested across time zones. The work required precision and patience, the kind of steady attention that rarely made headlines, but built lasting systems. One evening, as she reviewed a shipment report showing improved delivery times by 14% in the Chicago corridor, her phone lit up with a video call from Charlotte. The background behind her sister revealed warm Mediterranean colors and late afternoon sunlight. "We are back from Italy," Charlotte said with an easy smile. "And I have been thinking about what you told me. About infrastructure." Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, listening. Charlotte described how she and Daniel were considering launching a small boutique consulting firm together, something independent of family expectations, something that felt earned rather than inherited. I realized, Charlotte admitted, that I always assumed stability came from visibility, from the size of the event, the right address, the right audience. Eleanor considered her response carefully. Visibility can amplify, she said. It cannot replace foundation. Charlotte nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction without defensiveness. Their conversation stretched longer than usual, moving from strategy to risk tolerance, from branding to operational resilience. It was not competitive. It was collaborative. When the call ended, Eleanor sat for a moment in the soft glow of her desk lamp, reflecting on how different this exchange felt from the comparisons that once defined their relationship. Days later, a small package arrived at her office. Inside was a framed photograph from the vineyard, the family lined beneath golden lights. Eleanor stood closer to the center than she remembered, her expression composed, her posture steady. On the back, Linda had written a simple note. Perspective changes with distance. Eleanor placed the frame on a shelf in her office, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of conflict resolved, but as evidence that perception could evolve. That week, Thomas sent her a draft of a speech he planned to deliver at a regional business forum, asking for feedback on his section about entrepreneurship. The irony did not escape her, yet there was no bitterness attached. She edited a few lines for clarity, returned it with concise suggestions, and moved on to reviewing a contract proposal from Dallas. Outside her window, rain streaked softly down the glass, steady and unremarkable. The narrative that once confined her had not been overturned in a single dramatic moment. It had shifted gradually, through evidence, presence, and restraint. As Eleanor closed her laptop for the evening and prepared to leave the office, she glanced once more at the framed photograph. The vineyard lights were frozen in time, but she no longer felt anchored to that scene. She felt anchored to movement, to progress measured not by applause, but by continuity. And as she stepped into the cool Seattle air, her coat collar turned up against the wind, she understood that growth is rarely loud. It is persistent, deliberate, and often invisible until someone chooses to look more closely. Spring arrived gradually in Seattle, softening the edges of winter with longer evenings and pale blue skies that lingered over the water. Eleanor's expansion into Dallas was finalized in early April, the lease signed on a 120,000 square foot facility just outside the city, strategically positioned near major freight corridors. The numbers aligned cleanly on her screen, projections steady, margins sustainable. She approved the final documents without ceremony, understanding that growth did not require celebration to be meaningful. A week later, an email arrived from the organizers of a national supply chain summit in Chicago. They were inviting her to speak on a panel about innovation in mid-market logistics. The message was professional, direct, and clear about her qualifications. It was not an invitation extended through family connections or reputation borrowed from someone else's achievements. It was recognition grounded in results. Eleanor accepted after reviewing her calendar, scheduling the trip with the same precision she applied to freight contracts. When she mentioned the conference during a call with Linda, there was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by quiet pride. "We would like to attend," her mother said carefully, as if asking permission rather than assuming entitlement. Eleanor considered the request for a brief moment. "You are welcome," she replied evenly. In Chicago, the conference center buzzed with executives, analysts, and entrepreneurs moving between sessions with coffee cups and branded lanyards. Eleanor stood backstage before her panel, reviewing concise notes she had written in her familiar notebook. There were no dramatic flourishes in her preparation, only clear points about infrastructure resilience, data transparency, and scalable systems for independent retailers. When her name was introduced, the applause was polite but sincere, the recognition earned rather than inherited. She spoke without raising her voice, outlining how early inefficiencies had forced her to redesign entire workflows, how precision had replaced assumption, how small improvements compounded over time. In the audience, Thomas and Linda sat side by side, listening without commentary, absorbing the language of metrics and strategy that once seemed distant from their understanding. There was no visible reaction, no exaggerated pride, only attentive silence. After the session, several attendees approached Eleanor with questions about implementation and partnership opportunities. Thomas stood a few steps away, observing the steady exchange. When a fellow conference guest asked how she had entered the industry, Eleanor answered simply, "I began where the gaps were." Later that evening, as they walked along the Chicago River under city lights reflecting off the water, Thomas spoke quietly. "You built something that stands on its own," he said. Eleanor nodded once. That was always the goal. The skyline shimmered around them, tall buildings rising without explanation or apology. And as they paused on the bridge, watching boats glide beneath them, the distance that once defined their conversations felt replaced by something steadier, not dramatic reconciliation, but understanding rooted in evidence. Eleanor did not need the applause from the panel. She did not need the shift in tone from her parents. The work continued regardless. Yet as she returned to her hotel that night, reviewing emails about Midwest freight performance, she recognized that growth had expanded beyond warehouses and shipping routes. It had reshaped perception, not through confrontation, but through consistency.